On March 3, 1945, as the last winter of the European War reluctantly loosened its grip, a cold mist hung over the banks of the Rhine near Remagen. The American engineers working to reinforce the Ludendorff Bridge were not yet aware that they would soon make history. But the units streaming through behind them had more immediate concerns. Lines of captured German personnel, men, women, auxiliaries, and displaced civilians, were being processed in improvised collection points that had sprung up across the Western Bank like hurriedly built islands of order in a collapsing world. One of these temporary holding areas sat in a muddy field just outside Linz am Rhein, enclosed not by fences, but by the overwhelming momentum of the Allied advance. Trucks arrived all morning from shattered Wehrmacht units, bringing prisoners who no longer fought, no longer fled, and in many cases no longer believed much of anything at all. Among the captured groups was a contingent of Betreuungshelferinnen, German women attached to Wehrmacht rear area formations. Some had worked as clerks or laundry assistants, others as cooks or administrative aides, but a portion of them were what American intelligence classified, sometimes too broadly, sometimes too bluntly, as comfort girls, women who had been compelled or persuaded into serving the needs of military units in ways that the surrendering officers preferred not to describe. Their arrival in the American sector came with fear so deep it seemed older than the war itself. The women sat packed inside a canvas-covered Opel Blitz truck, its engine coughing as it rolled into the American checkpoint. They had been pushed from town to town for weeks as front lines collapsed faster than orders could be issued. Many had slept in stables or abandoned houses. Others hadn't slept at all. Now, as American MPs signalled the vehicle to halt, the women clutched their thin coats and blankets, preparing themselves for what they had been told for years would happen if they were ever captured alive. Inside the truck, Liselotte Brandt, 24 years old, wrapped her arms around herself as the tailboard was lowered. She had been part of a field service detachment in the Saar region, where rumours about the enemy had been drilled into them like field regulations. "They will strip you, humiliate you, parade you," one sergeant had warned. "American soldiers do not treat German women as human." Now she saw the helmets outside, the rifles slung across broad shoulders, and every warning she had ever heard seemed to press its weight against her spine. A young American sergeant, chewing on a cold biscuit, looked up at the group as they stepped down into the mud. His reaction was not anger or triumph, but exasperation, yet not directed at them. The processing point was overwhelmed. Another truck meant more paperwork, more questioning, more wet boots. But the women read something else in his expression. Fear made ordinary faces into ominous shapes and ordinary gestures into threats. When the sergeant gestured for them to form a line, several flinched as if struck. The Americans began the intake procedure with routine efficiency. Names, ages, units, roles, personal effects placed into canvas sacks. A medical check was required next, not to inspect them for punishment, but for lice, trench fever, frostbite, malnutrition, respiratory infections, and the dozens of ailments sweeping the collapsing Reich. Army regulations were rigid about processing all POWs the same, regardless of gender, but the women didn't know that. All they heard was the next command: "Step forward, one at a time." A ripple of panic travelled down the line. A corporal approached with a clipboard and repeated the phrase in heavily accented German. "Einzeln vortreten." The women stiffened. Several murmured to each other. Liselotte grabbed the sleeve of the woman next to her, a 19-year-old named Annika, whose lips were trembling. Word spread quickly. The Americans were about to make them undress. Some had seen Soviet leaflets warning that Western POW camps were dens of humiliation. Others had heard stories from retreating German units, stories often invented by desperate men looking to justify their flight or to mask their own actions. Either way, the fear had become real. When an American medic approached carrying a satchel, the panic broke the surface. "Wir ziehen uns nicht aus," one of the women cried. We won't take our clothes off. Another shouted the same thing, then another. Within seconds, the cluster of exhausted, frightened women had turned into a wall of defiance. They held their coats closed with white knuckles. They backed away from the medic. One tried to shield the others with her body. The Americans froze, startled not by the words, they didn't understand most of them, but by the sudden shift in energy. The sergeant stepped forward, hands raised, trying to calm them, but his attempt only made them more frantic. Lieselotte felt her breath shorten. The last German Feldwebel she had seen before capture had whispered to her, "They will make examples of you. Women like you will not be treated as POWs. Prepare yourself." Now she saw the medic's satchel and imagined the worst. One woman tried to run, slipping in the mud. Another grabbed her arm and pulled her back, not out of obedience, but because they were safer together than apart. American MPs exchanged confused glances. Some laughed nervously, not at the women, but at the absurdity of being blamed for something they didn't understand. The shouting grew louder. Then something happened that none of the German women anticipated. Instead of forcing them, insisting, or threatening, the American medic took 3 steps backward, opened his satchel, and deliberately removed a stack of clean wool blankets. He held them up where the women could see, then placed them on a crate in front of him. Next, he removed a bundle of women's undergarments, newly issued from Red Cross supplies. Cotton, clean, folded. He pointed to the blankets, then to the women. He spoke slowly, clearly, in English, knowing they wouldn't understand the words but hoping they might understand the tone. "These are for you, for warmth. No one is stripping anyone." He then stepped back again, hands open, palms visible. The women looked at the blankets, the way starving people look at food they aren't convinced is real. They whispered to each other. Suspicion wrestled with confusion. Nothing in their training, nothing in the Reich's propaganda machine, had prepared them for this moment. The sergeant, seeing their hesitation, knelt down and spread one of the blankets on the crate so they could see it was safe. He tapped his chest, then pointed gently at them, repeating, "Für euch." For you. It was the tone, not the words, that finally broke the tension. Annika reached forward first, her hand shaking more from hunger than fear. She picked up one of the blankets. The wool was thick, warm, and incredibly clean. Cleaner than anything she had touched in weeks. She looked at Lieselotte with wide eyes, as if seeking permission from someone who no longer knew more than she did. Another woman stepped forward, then another. Soon, the entire group was clutching blankets to their chests, as if the fabric were proof that the world had not fully descended into barbarity. The Americans resumed the intake process, but now the energy had changed entirely. The medical inspection turned out to be nothing more than checking for frostbite on fingers, examining faces for jaundice, asking them to cough, not remove their clothing. The women kept their coats on the entire time. For many of them, the shock of this treatment was more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty was expected. Kindness was terrifying. As the sun rose higher, the women were directed toward a tent where warm barley soup was being ladled out into metal cups. The steam rose like a promise. Some cried silently while drinking it, overwhelmed by relief they didn't yet dare to believe in. The American cooks looked confused. Feeding POWs was just another task, not a moral revelation. By mid-morning, the women were seated on the dry straw laid across the floor of a long canvas tent, each wrapped in a blanket. Lieselotte stared at the frayed hem of hers, running her thumb across it again and again, grounding herself in the texture. In her mind, one thought kept returning. Everything we were told was wrong. The fear didn't vanish instantly. Trauma never obeys the clock. But the expected violation never came. Instead, the women were treated exactly like other surrendering personnel. Searched respectfully, medically assessed, fed, and directed to temporary quarters. As distant artillery rumbled somewhere beyond the ridges, The women finally understood something that would shape their memories of captivity for the rest of their lives. It wasn't that the Americans were saints. It wasn't that war was suddenly merciful. It was something simpler, almost mundane, the procedures of an army that considered dignity as part of discipline. And that mundane reality was more shocking than any myth the Reich had ever fed them. Through the late hours of March 3, 1945, the field camp near Linz am Rhein settled into a rhythm that looked orderly from a distance, but felt chaotic from within. The Americans struggled to process an unending stream of prisoners, displaced civilians, stragglers, and wounded who appeared on the roads as if carried forward by the collapsing weight of the Reich. The German women processed earlier were now part of this temporary, unsteady machine of survival. Inside the long canvas tent where the women rested, the air was warmer than outside, but heavy with the smell of damp wool, straw, and fatigue. The blankets the Americans had given them still felt almost unreal. Most of the women held them close, not because of the temperature, though it was still cold, but because the softness was so foreign after weeks of flight. Lieselotte sat with her back against a support pole, legs drawn close to her chest. Around her, the women whispered their thoughts in fragments, whether their families were alive, what had happened to their old units, what the Americans would do next. A few wondered aloud how long they would stay here. No one had answers. Word had spread through the tent about the moment earlier that morning, how they had panicked, how they had shouted that they would not undress, how the Americans had responded not with force but with blankets. Some women laughed quietly at the memory, not because it was funny, but because the contrast between fear and reality was too great to grasp. The guards outside moved back and forth across the mud, but their movements lacked the sharpness the women had expected. Instead of barking commands, they spoke to each other in a casual rhythm, complaints about the cold, the mud on their boots, the endless paperwork, the bad coffee that seemed to grow worse every week of the war. At one point, an MP stepped into the tent to take a head count. He paused when he saw several women stiffen at his approach. Instead of stepping closer, he simply pointed at his notepad, counted silently, nodded politely, and stepped out again without saying a word. The whole process took 15 seconds. But for women who had been told for years that American soldiers would violate or abuse them on sight, that gesture, minimal, almost indifferent, felt strangely protective. Late that afternoon, an American lieutenant arrived at the processing point, accompanied by 2 translators, German-speaking soldiers from Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, both the sons of immigrants who had grown up speaking dialects their grandmothers taught them. Their presence alone was enough to ease the tension in the air. For the first time since capture, the women could finally understand what the Americans intended. The lieutenant addressed them plainly. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the laws of war. You will not be harmed. You will be relocated to a more permanent holding area as soon as transportation is available." No promises beyond that, no embellishments, just the facts. For Lieselotte, the impact was immediate and disorienting. She had expected the Americans to speak down to them, or threaten them, or demand something humiliating. Instead, their tone was neither friendly nor cruel, simply procedural. In a way, it felt more trustworthy than kindness would have. The translator added gentle clarifications. "No one will take your clothing. No one will force you. We follow rules here, not revenge." Some of the women began to cry, quietly, from a mix of relief and the exhaustion of carrying fear for too long. The lieutenant left as quickly as he came, swallowed up by the camp's chaos. But his message lingered. Near dusk, the women were escorted to a new area, within the holding field, where the ground had been flattened and lined with straw. The Americans had erected rows of small pyramidal tents. Nothing luxurious, just standard issue. Canvas shelters large enough for 4 people. The tents were cold, drafty, and smelled faintly of canvas dye, but to the women, they looked like places where no one would come for them in the night. 4 women to a tent felt almost intimate. For weeks they had slept in barns or ditches, surrounded by too many bodies, always afraid. Now, even with thin walls, the smallness of the space made them feel safer. They arranged themselves, according to companionship forged on the road. Lieselot shared her tent with Annika, a seamstress named Clara, and a former railway clerk named Margarete. The first night passed in fragments of sleep, interrupted by distant artillery, the rustle of guards switching shifts, and the occasional sobs of women in nearby tents. But no guard entered without warning. No one shouted at them. No one touched them. By morning, a fragile sense of routine had begun to settle in. Breakfast arrived in the form of watery oatmeal carried in large metal containers. The Germans received it alongside other POWs, aircrew, infantry, a few Volkssturm teenagers who looked too young to shave. The Americans handed out spoons and cups like an assembly line. There was no favoritism, there was also no discrimination. Everyone received the same ladleful. The women noticed again the indifference in the Americans' eyes. The guards were tired, underfed, irritated by mud, but they were not hostile. They were simply doing their jobs. Later in the morning, a medic visited the women's section of the encampment to conduct follow-up checks. He came with a translator this time, which changed everything. The women no longer had to guess what was being asked of them. They were asked to extend their hands so he could check circulation. He pressed a thumb lightly against fingernails to observe colour return. He looked at their faces and noted signs of anemia. He asked about coughs, fevers, injuries. "Do any of you have open wounds?" he asked through the translator. Clara hesitated, then revealed a cut she had been hiding beneath her wrist. It was small, infected, and poorly bandaged. The medic cleaned it with iodine, applied a fresh bandage, and gave her a tablet of sulphur. She expected pain. Instead, the gentleness nearly undid her. As he moved to the next woman, she whispered to Lieselotte, "I thought medicine was not for prisoners." Lieselotte had no answer. In the afternoon, the camp became tense, not because of the women, but because of an incoming wave of new POWs arriving from the direction of Bonn. Word spread that a mixed group of Wehrmacht and SS personnel would soon be processed. The shift in the guards' posture was visible, backs straighter, hands closer to their holsters, eyes more alert. The women saw it and realized, with dawning clarity, that the Americans drew distinctions. Not all POWs were viewed the same. For the first time, they wondered aloud if, ironically, their gender had become a shield rather than a liability. The arrival of the new POWs also meant reorganization. The women were directed to pack their limited belongings, blankets, coats, and whatever they carried when captured, and move toward a convoy of trucks that would transport them to a more permanent POW camp in the rear areas of the American zone. The women moved in a line, quiet, tense, unsure. The trucks were open-topped, with benches along the sides. MPs assisted them by offering hands to help them step up, not out of chivalry, but habit. Some women recoiled at first, still unsure if touch implied control, but gradually they realized the guards stepped back the moment the women were safely aboard. Once loaded, the trucks rumbled to life and began their journey southward. The wind was cold, but the blankets helped. The countryside rolled past them in shades of brown and grey. Villages with shattered windows, abandoned carts, orchards where no one had walked for months. In one village, children emerged from ruined doorways to stare at the convoy. Some waved at the Americans, others simply watched with hollow eyes. 2 hours later, the convoy reached a more established POW enclosure surrounded by triple-strand barbed wire. It was orderly, with guard towers, wooden barracks, latrines, and a field kitchen. This was not a temporary chaos like Linz am Rhein. This was a system. As the women filed out of the trucks, the American officer in charge raised his hand and asked the translators to gather them close. "You will be assigned quarters here. You will have scheduled meals, medical treatment, and daily roll calls. You are safe. Follow the rules, and nothing bad will happen to you." The barracks assigned to the women were small but insulated. The walls were thin planks covered in tar paper, but compared to the previous night's tent, they felt like fortresses. Inside were double bunks with straw mattresses, coarse woolen blankets, and a stove in the centre that radiated a faint but steady heat. Some women sat on the bunks in silence, absorbing the stability of walls. Others unpacked what few possessions they had. Annika held her blanket tightly, refusing to put it down even when offered a bedspread. Lieselotte opened a small tin that held 2 buttons, a broken brooch, and a photograph of her younger brother. Nothing of value, except to her. She placed it under her mattress, as if hiding it made her a person again. The hours stretched on. A Red Cross representative arrived to inspect conditions, speaking with the American officers, checking the barracks, and asking the women if they had complaints. The women stared at him, stunned. No one had ever asked them if they had complaints. We are fine, Margaret finally said, her voice trembling. That evening, a pot of potato soup was distributed. It was thin, barely flavoured, but hot. Some women cried again while eating it. Not because of the taste, but because after months of chaos, hunger, abuse from retreating German units, and terror about what capture meant, the warmth of a meal without humiliation felt like a memory from another life. As night fell, the women lay in their bunks, listening to the muffled conversations of American guards outside and the crackling stove within. The barracks felt like a cocoon against the storm of the disintegrating Reich. For the first time in months, sleep came without fear of footsteps in the dark. Lieselotte stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the stove reflecting off the wooden beams. Everything she had been taught about Americans, barbarians, violators, dishonorable, was dissolving. She wondered how many other lies she had believed. She whispered into the darkness, not to anyone in particular. If this is captivity, then what were we running from? The answer hovered somewhere between exhaustion and awakening. Outside, the war continued. But inside the barracks, a quiet truth had begun to take root. Dignity, when offered unexpectedly, could be the most disarming force of all. By the morning of March the 5th, 1945, the women's POW barracks in the American-controlled zone had settled into an unexpected rhythm. It wasn't comfort, nor normalcy. War had carved too deeply for that. But it was structure, predictability, and protection. 3 things none of the German women had felt for many months. The stove in the center of the barracks burned slowly through the early hours, tended by an American guard whose shift required him to ensure the women didn't freeze during the late winter nights. He never entered the room without knocking, and he never lingered. He simply fed the stove, nodded once, and left. It was a small thing, but the women noticed. At roll call, the women lined up outside the barracks, their breath forming clouds. The American sergeant checked names against his clipboard, correcting pronunciations awkwardly but without impatience. When he reached Lieselotte's name, he looked up, squinted at the letters, and attempted it again until she nodded. It was the first time in months anyone had bothered to get her name right. After roll call, they returned to the mess area where they received coffee substitute and coarse bread. The camp kitchen was run by a combination of American cooks and captured German army bakers, men who preferred kneading dough to sitting in a crowded enclosure. The women were surprised to see German POWs working voluntarily under American supervision, speaking casually with the Americans as if old routines had replaced old loyalties. Breakfast was followed by what the Americans called orientation, though the women didn't know the word. A translator explained it: the rules of the camp, the layout, designated areas, mealtimes, medical schedules, and the boundaries of their section. The camp was not co-ed. The women were housed separately from male POWs. Close proximity existed, but carefully monitored fences and watchtowers ensured no mixing except under controlled circumstances. This separation, which the German women initially interpreted as isolation, quickly revealed itself as protection, especially after they observed some of the incoming male POW transfers later that day. Just after noon, a column of new prisoners arrived, mostly Wehrmacht infantry, some Luftwaffe ground staff, and a handful of SS personnel whose posture and expressions drew immediate suspicion from the guards. The Americans tightened security visibly. They escorted the SS men at gunpoint to a different compound entirely, one designed for high-risk prisoners. The German women watched from a distance as the SS men were processed. Their arrogance, even now, was unmistakable. Their glares toward the women were darker than anything the Americans had shown. It dawned on the women that the danger they feared from their captors might have come instead from men wearing their own uniforms. Later that afternoon, a Red Cross supply truck arrived, stirring excitement across the entire camp. For days the women had spoken about rumours, soap, postcards, chocolate, toothpaste. The driver, a Swiss civilian with a clipped accent and a neutral demeanour, supervised the unloading of crates filled with individually wrapped parcels. The officer in charge explained through a translator that each POW would receive one parcel every few weeks, depending on supplies. The women received theirs with hesitation, as if touching something forbidden. Inside were items that felt almost luxurious: a bar of soap, a small tin of condensed milk, crackers, powdered cocoa, a packet of cigarettes, which none of the women smoked, but all knew could be traded, a handkerchief, and a tiny printed card explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention. Some stared at the card longer than the food. The afternoon passed with the quiet hum of adjustment. Some women washed their hair for the first time in weeks, using the bar of soap carefully to make it last. Others sat near the stove, brushing out tangles with fingers. The mundane act of grooming became an act of recovery. Later, 2 American female clerks arrived to conduct interviews. Their presence astonished the German women. Female American personnel in uniform, unafraid, authoritative, addressing them with professional detachment. The interviews were short and factual: personal history, unit affiliation, health concerns, dependents, last known residence. The clerks asked no accusatory questions, only those needed to establish POW records. Lieselotte's interview was brief. When asked whether she had been mistreated by German units during the retreat, she hesitated. The clerk noticed. "You can answer freely," the translator reassured. "No one here will punish you for the truth." Lieselotte finally said quietly, "The German Feldwebel threatened us. He said we would be punished for being women among soldiers, that we would be accused of things." The clerk wrote this down without judgment. She looked up only once to say, "You are safe from him now." The words settled over Lieselotte like a weight lifted from behind her shoulders. In the days that followed, the camp settled into an unexpected pattern of stability that the women learned to trust slowly, piece by fragile piece. Each morning began with roll call, then breakfast, then routine inspections. Doctors visited regularly, checking for malnutrition, trench foot, and respiratory disease. The women had expected to be dismissed or ignored, but the medics were thorough. They checked for lice, but discreetly. They examined wounds, but never demanded unnecessary removal of clothing. The humiliation they had feared never came. On March 9th, the camp commander, a middle-aged captain who carried himself with the weary practicality of a man who had seen too much of war, asked for a group of German women to assist in the laundry building. It wasn't forced labour. Participation was voluntary. But nearly all of them agreed. The idea of doing something normal, something useful, something orderly felt like reclaiming a part of themselves that the war had stripped away. The laundry was warm, filled with steam that softened the winter air. German women and American female personnel worked side by side, not as equals, not as friends, but as people sharing a task. Communication was clumsy but cordial. The Americans showed the women how to use industrial washers and presses. The women worked with disciplined precision. They knew routines, and routines grounded them. In the evenings, the women returned to the barracks, tired but calmer. Some of them talked about what the Americans had done that first day, how they had responded not with aggression but with blankets. That moment had become a kind of symbol in the barracks, retold quietly like a campfire story, each retelling softening the memory of their terror. Around March 12th, a German nurse named Ilse, captured separately and newly assigned to the women's barracks, arrived at the camp. Her appearance shocked the others. She was pale, underweight, her hands trembling from untreated fever. The Americans immediately directed her to the infirmary. She returned 2 days later, somewhat stronger. The nurse told the others that she had been treated with respect, given medicine, warm blankets, and food. Her story became the final piece of evidence the women needed to understand. Their captors were not waiting for the right moment to harm them. The fear that had clung to them like a second skin finally began to loosen. By mid-March, the women were allowed supervised walks around the perimeter of their section. They watched the camp's rhythms: prisoners mending uniforms, American guards repairing fences, Red Cross vehicles coming and going. They saw German men treated firmly but not cruelly. They saw SS prisoners separated and under stricter supervision. They saw the difference between discipline and punishment. One afternoon, while standing near the fence line, Liselott overheard an American guard speaking to his comrade. "Some of 'em are terrified of us, like we're monsters." "Hell," the second guard replied. "You treat folks decent, and it freaks them out more than yelling does." It was meant as casual banter, but to the women listening, it carried the ring of truth. By the end of March, something remarkable had happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply human. The women no longer jumped when guards approached. They no longer slept with their boots on out of fear of sudden flight. They no longer clutched their coats as shields against imagined threats. Routine had become safety. Safety had become trust. Not full trust, not naive belief, but recognition of boundaries and rules. Underneath everything, beneath the war, beneath defeat, beneath exhaustion, the most shocking change of all was happening internally. Dignity was returning. One evening, during a distribution of mail forms, the translator explained that they could now write postcards home. The women stared at the blank cards for a long time, unsure where to begin. Annika finally wrote a single sentence. "I am alive, and the Americans have not done what we feared." Liselotte wrote something similar, but added a detail she never would have imagined just weeks earlier. "They gave us blankets, not commands." As spring crept in, and the war's final weeks approached, the women in the camp understood a truth that contradicted everything they had been told. Humanity, when shown in small, consistent acts, was more shocking than cruelty. It disarmed them, humbled them, and forced them to confront how deeply they had been misled, not just about the enemy, but about themselves. Captivity had not broken them. It had restored the parts of them that fear had stolen. And when they later recalled the moment they shouted, "We won't take our clothes off," they remembered not the panic, but what followed. The blankets laid gently on a crate by men they had been taught to hate. The war had taken nearly everything from them. But in an American POW camp in March 1945, it gave them back something almost as valuable as freedom: the understanding that dignity could survive even after collapse, and that kindness, quiet, procedural, unadorned, could shock more deeply than violence ever could.